out. So there we go. The talk is officially going to start. Okay, so like I said, fictionalizing the Franklin expedition with Fiona Moore in support of the Edmonton 2030 bid and with interventions from cats as they see fit. Okay. So, first of all, the two questions you're probably asking, who am I and why am I giving this talk? Because, yeah, famous Canadian something or other, but, what am I famous for and what did I do to wind up with a talk like this? Okay. I am in my day job professor of business anthropology at Royal Holloway University of London, which has a very special connection to the Franklin expedition that we'll talk about later on. Um, I, but in between this, I have a sort of a parallel academic career, writing SF criticism and guidebooks, and sometimes this overlaps. Usually my calling card in both sessions is the fact that I've written a book called Management Lessons from Game of Thrones, which once people stop laughing, they realize is a perfectly logical combination. And I'm following it up with a book coming out next year called Management Lessons from Lord of the Rings. Yes, if you like this talk, do please not only visit my blog, but consider buying my book. And most recently, one of my publications along the lines of SF criticism and guidebooks was a paper which came out in this year's first Foundation journal called Comparing Colonialisms in Dan Simmons' The Terror and its AMC Adaptation, earlier versions of which were presented at Helsinki Worldcon and at the Royal Geographical Society. And the fact that I've been working on this paper since 2019 gives you some idea of, how slowly the wheels of academia grind, particularly when, as I said, it's not, this is your secondary specialty as far as your workplace is concerned. But anyway, so that's why me giving the talk. Next one, though, is, we'll get into why this year in a couple of slides. Next thing is, what is the Franklin expedition? I'm assuming most people here have at least vaguely heard of it, again, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But just to make sure that everybody is 100% up on what it is. The Franklin expedition is a Victorian Arctic expedition. During this period when the British Navy, having conquered pretty much everybody who was going to be going to put up any resistance, they then wound up kind of turning into a sort of a scientific or essentially a scientific society with occasional military and colonial attachments. One of the odd paradoxes of this particular period is that Franklin himself, despite being a commissioned naval officer, was also a committed pacifist. This is when you know about this, Star Trek makes a hell of a lot more sense. People who start saying, why are people doing science on a naval vessel? It's like, well, it's basically the Victorian Navy is what it is. Anyway, so Sir John Franklin, there at the top, set out with a crew and two ships. The main aim of the expedition was to discover the Northwest Passage, the then theoretical bit of sea between Canada and the Arctic, which should, again, theoretically, if you can find it, allow ships to sail across the top of the Arctic for commercial purposes and not have to do the dangerous trip around the Horn of Africa or South America, both of which were the only options for shipping at the time. As well as being of immense scientific interest, this was obviously of immense cultural economic and colonial interest for the British because they would be able to take a relatively safe commercial route through territory that they technically owned, though some people even at the time had questions about that. Um, the expedition was not heard from for several years. Subsequent um, evidence indicated that by 1848, both ships, the Erebus and the Terror, were abandoned, and most, if not all, of the crew were dead. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane, who, to be honest, Franklin scholars say that if she'd been in charge of the expedition, they would have found the Northwest Passage and come back in a year. But anyway, yeah, she was one of these incredible powerhouses of Victorian England who um, devoted her talents to launching an effort to find them. She raised money for, sponsored, and generally supported quite a lot of investigations whose primary aim was finding her husband's expedition, but they wound up making so many scientific and geographical discoveries that she is the only woman of the period to have a bust in the Royal Geographical Society. That's it there. Other key figures who we'll be talking about just for so as you can put faces to names are Francis Crozier, who's the second one down there, who was in charge of the Terror, James Fitzjames, who was in charge of the Erebus, and both of whom are rather interesting figures we'll get to in a minute, and Lieutenant Graham Gore, who is not normally mentioned in the context of discussions about the Franklin expedition. Usually people go for sort of sexier and more interesting people like Good Sir or Stanley, but why are we talking about him? Because he is probably the person which I am reasonably sure most people at the Worldcon have heard. And the reason why is because The Ministry of Time is a novel, which we'll talk about again later in this talk, because it's a fictionalization of the Franklin expedition. And it is multi-award shortlisted, including for the Hugo. And so Graham Gore is a major character in that, and so therefore most people are probably thinking about it and possibly wondering what's so attractive about him and what he did and all that. Consequently, I've put up a picture of him so you know what the fuss is about. Okay, right. Whoops. Sorry. I have just spilled drink on the keyboard and am endeavoring to sop it up. However, before that, and why it's relevant, suddenly become relevant, few years ago, before the pandemic, AMC did an adaptation of Dan Simmons' novel, The Terror, which is to do with the Franklin expedition. That's a production picture from it there. And it is why, spoilers, I am drinking Monster for my choice of staying awake drink. Um, to be honest, when I was working on the initial stages of my paper, I found it very, very difficult to get a copy of this. I found a DVD that had seemed to was not only North American, but seemed to have only been released in Canada. Um, and then the pandemic happened, and the BBC put it on streaming, and suddenly everybody had seen it, particularly because in the pandemic, it's quite a relatable story, people slowly going crazy while stuck on two boats in some ice. So it suddenly, 3 years after it came out, got very popular indeed. Also, this is concurrent with the rediscovery of two of Franklin's two ships at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean under circumstances which are quite interesting, and we can talk about a bit later because they're not fictionalized. But these have brought them back into the public eye and also meant that AMC not only got a lot of support from the Canadian government for that, they got people from Parks Canada like actively involved with the program, working with them on the to make sure that the program was a bit more accurate than Simmons' book had been. Some of the inaccuracies in Simmons' book are definitely not Simmons' fault because, yeah, we hadn't found the boats at the time. We had no idea. Some of them really are Simmons' fault, and there are a few areas in which, you know, you can take issue and wonder why he made certain decisions that he did. Also, we are a Canadian bid party, and the Franklin expedition is keenly tied up with Canadian identity, as we will again discuss as we go through the talk. Okay, so, and consequently, I'm going to give you a quote from one of Canada's most famous writers on the subject of what the appeal of the Franklin expedition is. Um, to writers and why people want to write about it. Margaret Atwood, who not insignificantly wrote the introduction to what is otherwise a scientific book by two of the archaeologists who discovered Franklin relevant things. They're Beatty and Geiger down there are the ones who discovered the three bodies of deceased crew members. I haven't got any of the pictures here, but you can look for them online, and they make for pretty gruesome viewing, but they're also quite eerie. And I think it's not insignificant that they got a writer and one associated with Canadian identity strongly to write the introduction to the book, highlighting how much the Franklin expedition means to Canadians. Anyway, she says, there is something unnerving about people who can't be located dead or alive. Among the ancient Greeks, the dead who had not been retrieved and given the proper funeral ceremonies could not reach the underworld. They lingered in the world of the living as restless ghosts. Adding to the attraction of the Franklin story was the Arctic landscape that had subsumed leaders and men. The Arctic was dreary and lonesome and empty, but the Arctic was also a potent otherworld, imagined as a beautiful and alluring but potentially malign fairyland. So on the one hand, the Franklin expedition kind of represents hungry ghosts, ghosts with unfinished business who haven't been laid to rest and can't really be laid to rest yet. Um, and also, though, they are people who died in the Arctic, which is symbolically, yeah, it's terrifying. And also for the Victorians, as much as for perhaps more so than us, kind of a very strong reminder of the power of nature and human, the whole question of whether man v nature as a trope always goes in man's favor, which is where we come to the first of our fictional texts. The Franklin expedition absolutely gripped the minds of the Victorians, partly because it was, exciting and ongoing news, but partly because the Victorians, as we all know, love a good Gothic story, and for as Atwood just noted, this is a very Gothic story indeed. Um, Lady Franklin also was, a shameless publicist and kept her fundraising efforts going. Went on tours, that sort of thing. And of course, again, the expeditions that were sent out were also hugely popular. So there was an awful lot of public interest in the expedition and people waiting on news. And this is where Charles Dickens comes in. Um, Dickens actually wound up weighing in on an aspect of the expedition. One of the more successful attempts to find what happened to the expedition was mounted by an Orcadian explorer called John Ray. And the thing about Ray was that he was one of the explorers who had a very, very good relationship with the Inuit. Part of why he was so successful as an explorer was he dressed in Inuit clothing and spoke Inuktitut and worked in conjunction with a husband and wife team of Inuit explorers who are basically really ought to be credited as his collaborators, but of course at the time really weren't. And consequently, he had access to Inuit oral history in a way that a lot of other explorers didn't. And he came back with a report from the local Inuit, which indicated that people had found a few sort of really wretched and starving members of the expedition, and that they were now desperate enough that they were resorting to cannibalism. Now, this really, really shocked the Victorians to the core. The idea that, their brave, cannibalism's shocking under any circumstances, but the idea that their brave heroes were doing this was even worse. And Dickens lashed out in the press, basically saying either Ray's lying or the Inuit are lying, or maybe the Inuit murdered them and ate them themselves. So, you know, um, the Inuit kind of have a bit of an ambiguous relationship as native peoples go in the Victorian imagery. To some extent, they're seen more positively than a lot of indigenous peoples, kind of presented as people who are clever and strong and persistent enough to survive in a really terrifying, fatal landscape. But, when provoked, they always go fall back on the savages. And anyway, Dickens, still haunted and upset by this, wound up collaborating with Wilkie Collins, who's the one whose name gets on the credits, but it was a collaboration between the two of them on a play called The Frozen Deep. Now, this is sort of typical Victorian melodrama fodder. That image there is sort of the one engraving of the production that really circulates. The plot revolves around two men who are rivals for the same woman in typical kind of Victorian melodrama way. They both wind up by coincidence on the same Arctic expedition. The Arctic expedition meets a terrible fate. They are stranded in the Arctic. Um, One of them has the opportunity to basically murder the other and make it look like it was just ordinary death, but instead he sacrifices himself so that knowing that she loves his rival better, he sacrifices himself so that the man she really loves can survive and get back to England, and everybody is happy, and it's all a bit gruesome. The one of the things that really informs it, though, is that there is this kind of anti-cannibalism thing going through it. No, no, we couldn't possibly do something like that, not even to survive. It's just beyond the pale for us courageous British. And so you can sort of see where this is coming from in Dickens's mind. And yeah, so as Davis Fish, who has written a doctoral thesis on this, is about, she said that anxiety was centered on the spectre of these Inuit witnesses, and that the play engaged not with the trauma of cannibalism, but with the trauma of the British failure to witness what had happened. Nobody came back from the Franklin expedition, so we invent somebody who does come back from our fictional expedition. The play didn't get a wide circulation. It was performed as an Amdram Christmas play, and then I think staged like once after that, but it's kind of interesting pop culture wise. So we're going to skip forward now to the 1970s, and the Franklin expedition never stopped being interesting, but there was a literary revival of interest in it, I think largely sparked by the fact that Canada was starting to develop its social and political, and in particular its literary identity, kind of from really the late 60s onwards. I mean, the centennial seems to have sort of kicked things off, and then it kind of gathered steam. And as people began to work out a Canadian identity, this is another reason why I think Franklin is kind of interesting. Now, Gwendolyn McEwen, pictured on the right there, wrote a verse play for four characters: Franklin, Crozier, Rasmussen, who was one of the explorers who went after them, and I'm going to massacre the pronunciation because I don't speak Inuktitut, Qua Gek. I really apologize to any people who do speak that. I am so sorry. And it is actually, interestingly, an SFF play in that Rasmussen, as he searches for the expedition, literally speaks with dead Franklin and dead Crozier. But it isn't until he incorporates the Inuit voice through Kortinek that Rasmussen is able to learn the truth of what happened to the expedition. So essentially, what you're getting there is an explicit Canadianization of it, first of all, because kind of now the narrative is moving away from the British explorers to the native Canadians and to their take on the story. But also it's starting to see a movement where indigenous knowledge is gradually being seen as an alternative to scientific discovery, and McEwen is criticizing the marginalization of Inuit oral histories and other forms of oral tradition. This is also particularly relevant because key to finding the vessels was actually the fact that archaeologists started taking Inuit native oral histories seriously, you know, rather than dismissing them as Dickens did, or assuming that they were maybe fanciful and fictional. Well, first of all, people began actually corroborating European and native accounts of the same things and found out that Inuit history back to the Elizabethan era is actually pretty surprisingly accurate when we've got sort of a couple of views. But also that it is, it can really be seen even as a more interpretive thing, it can be seen as an alternative form of scientific knowledge, and one through which a lot of things are worked out. Anyway, this also one of the things that kind of gets me about the Parks Canada rediscovery of the vessels is that a certain amount hinged on the fact that a native place called, in rough translation, Big Boat Here turns out to actually have a big boat here. It's a sunken boat. Yeah. Now, next work I'm going to touch on is Solomon Gursky was here. Now, any Canadians in the room have undoubtedly heard of Mordecai Richler, if only because I'm pretty sure that parents still read his rather wonderful, subversive, and naughty children's book, Jacob Tutu and the Hooded Fang, to their children. And if not, you probably had to read The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz in high school English, which again is one of those books that, as a teenager, you're like, oh man, I'm being forced to read this piece of can lit. Wait, it's a piece of can lit with, at one point, an extensive description of a 60s alternative film with sex and violence. So I'm there for that. Um, Anyway, Richler is a really, if you haven't discovered Richler, I would recommend you do. He's a wonderfully witty and subversive author with Montreal Jewish, so connection to the, just announced Montreal bid. And, witty, subversive, and with a interesting take on the Canadian identity as somebody who is very emphatically Canadian, but also very emphatically proud of his identity as a Jewish Canadian and as the descendant of migrants to Canada. Now, the Franklin expedition is not the focus of Solomon Gursky was here, but it's key to it. The story takes the form of essentially a piece of historical discovery. A writer becomes obsessed with a very successful Canadian Jewish family called the Gurskys and starts researching their history and their rise to success. And the initial landfall, as it were, by the Gurskys on the North American continent is a fictional member of the Franklin expedition who is a Jewish tailor brought along on the expedition, who is the sole survivor and who survives by convincing the local Inuit that he is the savior. And this kind of sets up a pattern for the Gurskys. They're trickster figures. They're clever, but they're not always entirely ethical. And, they're willing to push any advantage they have, even if it's possibly dubious. And yet at the same time, the way in which they do this is quite clever and admirable. So Richler is in doing this kind of, I think, celebrating the Canadian immigrant experience. Immigration is very, very much tied up with the Canadian identity. I think this is, it's not insignificant that Canadians will, elect a far right politician in Stephen Harper, but the point at which they turf him out of office is when he starts saying immigrants are to blame for our problems. Um, uh, Hold on, you're saying my grandma is a troublemaker? But also that it's an ambiguous element, anybody with an immigrant background can have a look and know that the story of immigration is not always entirely heroic. It's not always entirely voluntary, and that people sometimes have to do very dodgy things to survive, and quite often they're doing very dodgy things to the native people to survive. So we kind of have that running there, that the Gurskys survive because they are able to deceive the natives. But also in that the Franklin expedition is so strongly tied up with Canadian identity, then Richler, by making the founding event the Franklin expedition, is kind of saying something. The Gurskys don't just kind of arrive on a 19th century boat, they are actively connected to the start of Canadian history and its roots and exploration. Next point we'll talk about is Ditch, which is a 1993 play, though it's, the most recent revival I was able to find with a brief dig around online was in 2011, but I have a feeling it's the sort of thing that might get performed uh, reasonably regularly on a smaller basis. This play sparks off of one of the grim discoveries of the fate of the Franklin expedition, which was the discovery of two skeletons in a lifeboat surrounded by food. Really, they were surrounded by chocolate packets. And again, a lot of people have asked questions about these. What were these two guys doing there? What were they doing in the lifeboat? Why did they have all this food around and yet die before they ate it? Now, Kavanaugh's play reimagines them as lovers, two men who are ditched by the expedition for their attraction to each other, who are slowly dying of hunger and exposure. But in the middle of this, they're finally able to express their mutual love. So you've sort of got an obvious theme going on there of kind of repression of sexuality in the Victorian culture, but which is liberated through them finally being able to throw off culture and go back to nature, all very Levi-Strauss here. Um, but also kind of the destructive nature of homophobia, that it's only through going into this landscape that will literally kill them, that the men are finally able to be themselves. And again, we have another theme going of people who are key to Canadian culture, but who are also marginalized by it. And now we start getting to my own special subject, as it were. Promise not to go on about it too much, which is Dan Simmons's novel, The Terror. Um, and this novel is definitely genre. In that it picks up with the expedition frozen in the ice. And the narrative is that whilst in the ice, they accidentally kill an Inuit shaman who is picked up by the expedition alongside his daughter. And in doing so, they unleash a demonic spiritual being which the shaman controls, the Toonback. And this is a piece of fan art showing the Toonback. I don't know the author's real name, I'm afraid. Um, the Toonback is sort of polymorphous. It's looks a bit like a polar bear. It looks a bit like something else. It looks a bit like a sea creature. It's huge, it's fierce. Again, there is possibly the possibility that it is actually a real animal and they're just having botulism hallucinations. But, symbolically, it is very much down there, the Toonback kind of representing, what happens when, first of all, nature being unconquerable. You have to, at the end of the story, Crozier, who is the sole survivor of the expedition, and again, spoilers here, but it's been around a while, so spoilers. Crozier survives with the aid of the shaman's daughter, who herself becomes a shaman on her father's death, and she joins with Crozier and teaches him how to become a shaman and to control the Toonback. But he learns in doing so that you can't kill nature, you can't conquer or subdue nature, you just have to learn a way of living with it. And this is also significant because Crozier, as he was in real life, is Irish. Now, this is one of the areas where I take a bit of issue with Simmons because he very much goes into stereotypes of the Irish as a conquered people who are somehow very spiritually aware through a kind of mystic Catholicism. Real life Crozier was a Protestant, and he was also from the Protestant community who were, socially dominant on Ireland. So, he was actually more colonizer than colonized. This isn't to say that this isn't relevant. I mean, one of the possible reasons why the expedition failed was that Crozier did actively face a prejudice because of his Irish origins. And although he, of the expedition's two second in commands, he had Arctic experience, spoke Inuktitut, had an Inuit name even, and yet Fitzjames was the one who was made the kind of the lead second in command and given command of the better vessel. And frankly, if they hadn't been prejudiced against Crozier's origins and had given him the second place, they might have had a better chance of survival. But, it is a bit more complicated. Effectively, though, the Toonback also symbolizes climate change, and Simmons appears at the end of the novel to come down to the idea that essentially Western colonial growth capitalist society is never going to stop climate change, and colonized people have to unite against both nature and the colonizers, and they're the only ones that really stand a chance. Now, the TV series adapts Simmons' novel, and you can see the casting is spot on. If you go back to those daguerreotypes, that's Franklin, that's Crozier, that's Fitzjames. I don't know, top actors, but also, my God, do they look like their original guys? Now, the TV series made some crucial changes. I mean, one of them was that they stayed closer to known facts about the crew. Crozier loses the whole mystical Irish thing, and also the fact that he, was familiar with the natives and spoke the language comes to the much more to the fore. Secondly, they pay more attention to the Inuit, specifically the Netzilik in this case. They worked with Netzilik advisors on how to interpret the Toonback and how to represent shamanism. And also, where the book can kind of get away with not giving the Inuit a voice for two-thirds of the novel and then suddenly, kind of take us all the way back and then give us the Inuit perspective in a nutshell. You can't really do that on television. So what they did was rather clever. They gave the Inuit a voice by having them active speaking Netzilik and then giving us the subtitles. So at the same time as we're seeing the European characters' interpretation, we're also getting the Inuit perspective on events as they talk to it. It's much more ambiguous in genre terms in that they are very much going down on the side of it could all be real. The way they represent the Toonback is based on an actual extinct Arctic animal, relative of the short-faced bear, which is a relative of the polar bear, and which looks like a polar bear with a human face. It's kind of freaky, but it really did exist. It really was a thing. So, kind of the suggestion is that they encountered a real animal, which ought to be extinct, but hey, we all know sometimes that's not the case, and just freaked out about it. There's also a shift in themes. They're much more pessimistic than um, Simmons, and although the ending is more or less the same, there's the idea is that more that the harm colonization has done can't be fixed. You can't. We've gone too far now. We can't restore balance, even if Crozier does kind of abandon Victorian society and join the Inuit. Effectively, the symbolic moment there is that the Inuit shaman Silna gives him her father had a carving of the Tunback through which he controlled the Tunback, and shaman Silna gives Crozier a little carving of the Terror, the ship, and so essentially colonization and civilization are the new monster, and Crozier is the one who can control it, if he wants to and he learns how. So there's kind of an apocalyptic theme where climate change is going to destroy not just the humans, but the Tunback, but nature itself, if we don't change our ways and start to view what we're doing as the monster. Finally, now, the reason we're here and the reason why we're doing this talk, despite its obvious relevance in other ways. Kellyanne Bradley's lovely book, The Ministry of Time, multi-award shortlisted and deservedly so. This again sparks off the Franklin expedition in that the genre seed, as it were, is that this is a near future UK where they have discovered a limited kind of time travel. They can bring people forward from the past into the 21st century. I won't spoil it by then going on about how this develops, but Graham, they are only focusing on bringing back people who are known to have died in their time, so they can't that bringing them forward at the point of their supposed death won't change history. And one of the ones they pick is Lieutenant Graham Gore, hence why I put up a daguerreotype of him, who is rescued and released into the wilds of 21st century climate changed London. And we see him through his relationship to his bridge, who is the narrator, the woman who's kind of tasked with helping him adjust to his new life. She is herself the child of immigrants from Cambodia, and they kind of explore and bond through their common refugee experience, as it were, him through time and her through space. Again, the climate change becomes a key theme as we start to see that climate change is more advanced in this future and actively destroying and um, uh, people's lives in London in a very apocalyptic sort of way. Sexuality and culture, again, is another emerging theme as the two characters, spoilers, but it's pretty bloody obvious from page one this is going to happen, become lovers, but also as they kind of explore other aspects through the other rescued people from the past, two of whom are queer, and with their friendship with the narrator and with Gore himself. And there is the question of can people change? Can history change? Can the future change? So, yeah, tying into common themes about the Franklin expedition, which is where I'm going next. So yeah, some common themes running through this whistle stop tours. You've probably been putting them together in your mind so far, but yeah, colonization and decolonization are a big part of this. The Franklin expedition kind of representing the limits of colonization. It was a colonial expedition, not in the sense of going out there to actively conquer, but it was essentially aimed at claiming territory on the part of a colonial power and for the commercial interests of this colonial power. And the fact that it failed and was very much destroyed by the land it tried to conquer is, I think, a potent thing for people, particularly in the post-colonial era. I use the term post-colonial in the same sense as post-COVID, not meaning it's over, but meaning we're kind of living with the consequences. Another common discourse is about climate change and climate catastrophe running through this. Again, the fact that, the Franklin expedition were undone by the weather, really, is, I think, again, a potent part of Canadian identity is that, as in a poem by a relatively recent Canadian immigrant, the final line is, "This is a country that can kill you just from being outside." And this is, I think, one of these sort of penny drop moments about Canada for people who come to live to the country that, in this is a country where, in the case of man versus the environment stands a very good chance of winning. Interestingly, another common theme is about kind of sexuality through the books and series. I'm not quite sure why the Franklin expedition has become such a focus for sexuality. Possibly it is the idea of kind of queer relationships in an all-male environment, or on the other side of it, the fact that it's still not entirely disproven that one or more of the expedition members might have assimilated into native societies. We haven't found we haven't found mitochondrial DNA from the expedition members, but all that means is that they didn't leave maternal descendants. They could that there is the jury is still out on whether or not they did assimilate. But also indigenous identities, since again the native narrative is key to the discovery and rediscovery of the expedition and the story of what happened to them. And also kind of the running through all these is a theme of minorities and their representation. LGBTQ plus people, indigenous people, Jewish people in the case of Richler's story, and migrants, refugees of all kinds. Finally, as I said, getting into the Canadian identity, I've saved this lovely quote from Atwood to the end of the talk because she, as usual, is quite pithy and says, "If you break it, you own it. Canada's North broke Franklin, a fact that appears to have conferred an ownership title of sorts." Yeah, in a way, just the fact that this is an expedition whose fate speaks so much to the Canadian experience. You fight the land sometimes wins, and we all even in the warmer bits of Canada, the identity with the frozen north is strong. And also, this leads to an ambivalence from a very early stage of the hero colonizer myth in Canada. Canada doesn't Canada likes to focus on people like Franklin, who went out and colonized, but who, were not always successful and didn't always make it back. In some ways, one of the equivalents, when I was a young child, I went to French immersion school, so I learned the French Canadian colonizing story. And one of the first thing you learn about is the Jesuit martyrs, So again, European people who came to Canada to heroically colonize, in this case through converting people to Catholicism, and who wound up meeting a very gruesome fate. And I think that's, again, not accidental that this theme comes up over and over. Stan Rogers, I put up there, I didn't put him in as a fictionalization of the Franklin expedition because his song Northwest Passage isn't really a fictionalization, but, he kind of likens his own choosing and career as a musician and likens it to the Franklin expedition, somebody who left a settled life and threw it all away and who now travels the land as a kind of a ghost, Finally, I'll end on Atwood again. In her book Wilderness Tips, she talks about kind of the stockade or the mentality of Canadian literature that, in contrast to the frontier mentality in American literature, she says, in American literature, if you look at it, kind of there is the frontier mentality. You go someplace, if you don't like it or you eventually don't fit in, you go someplace new. Huck Finn ends with Huck saying, "I'll light out for the territories." Whereas in Canada, it's not so much about the frontier because any attempt to find the frontier is going to be stymied by those big cold 6 months of winter when any expedition conquering territory is going to have to hunker down for a good chunk of the year and stay surviving, getting on with people, but also kind of knowing when not to. And, yeah, this mentality of hunkering down behind walls and seeing out a threat is a big theme running through Canadian fiction all the way up to things like David Cronenberg. And it's very much exemplified by the fate of the Franklin expedition. So questions and discussion. And again, I'm finally going to end on, what's the connection to Royal Holloway that I mentioned at the start. Royal Holloway owns this painting. This is by popular Victorian artist Landseer, and it is a fictionalization of the Franklin expedition. It's called Man Proposes, God Disposes. And as you can see, it shows two polar bears eating an expedition. One of them's that one there's even got a little human rib bone in his mouth, and boy, doesn't he look like he's enjoying it. And the expedition it's eating is they're eating is generic, but Landseer did the painting explicitly thinking of the Franklin expedition. So all the themes are there in a visual fictionalization. But by the way, in terms of reclamation, the bear on the screen left there has become Royal Holloway's mascot. We dress a student up as a polar bear at our games. Our sports teams are the Royal Holloway Bears. And so we have, in a sense, reclaimed Franklin's Conquerors for our own. But I will stop the screen now. Thank you all for coming. I will stop the screen share and the recording so we can all have Q&A, and so I can check the chat and see what people have want to ask.